At its wartime peak, Vanport, Oregon, held 42,000 people, a 150-bed hospital, 5 schools, 2 shopping centers, and a movie theater with 750 seats. It was the second largest city in the state, though no resident could elect a mayor. Less than 4 years later, floodwater broke through a railroad embankment and gave 18,500 people about 35 minutes to escape. By evening, the buildings were floating, the streets were underwater, and Vanport had ceased to exist. Before there was a Vanport, the ground north of Portland was not empty. It was water arranged in different forms. The main channel of the Columbia River ran along the northern edge of the peninsula, broad enough to separate Oregon from Washington. To the south, the Columbia Slough moved west through a nearly level chain of wetlands, side channels, ponds, and low fields before joining the Willamette River. Smith Lake lay to the west. Force Lake sat inside the lowland itself. Between them were mud, sedges, cottonwoods, shallow water, and ground that changed shape with the season. This watershed was part of the homeland of Upper Chinook people, who traveled its channels, fished its water, hunted along its margins, and gathered food from the wetlands. It was not unused land waiting for a city. The rivers, lakes, and seasonally flooded ground formed a connected system, one that carried people and fish across a landscape where the difference between land and water was never entirely fixed. The Columbia Slough was not simply a smaller version of the river beside it. It was a remnant of the Columbia's older floodplain, a narrow waterway stitched to lakes and channels left behind as the river shifted. When the Columbia rose, that flat ground offered water somewhere to go. It spread through marshes and filled low places. What appeared on a summer map as separate lakes could become parts of the same body of water during a flood. White settlers cut timber, cleared fields, and placed farms and industrial plants along the slough. By the early 20th century, the peninsula held stockyards, slaughterhouses, roads, drainage canals, and rail lines. Each new investment made the wet ground more valuable. It also made the river's old freedom of movement more expensive. In 1907, the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway began building across the peninsula. At the western edge of the future Vanport site, its tracks crossed the lowland on a timber trestle. Several years later, workers buried that structure inside a wide bank of earth, leaving the old wood within the fill and laying the rails across the top. The embankment had one job. It carried trains. It was high and broad enough to interrupt water moving east from Smith Lake, but it had not been designed as a flood control levee. The railway maintained it as support for steel rails, wooden ties, locomotives, and freight cars. Its ability to hold back a river was incidental. By 1917, landowners along the Columbia Slough had organized 3 drainage districts. Crews dug ditches, deepened channels, and raised levees around agricultural and industrial property. The purpose was to separate dry land from the ordinary movements of the floodplain. Water that once spread across fields was directed into narrower spaces. Ground that had been wet according to the river's schedule could now be planted, sold, crossed by roads, or covered with buildings. Federal money extended that work after Congress passed the Flood Control Act of 1936. In 1941, the United States Army Corps of Engineers completed a protective system around the acreage that would soon become Vanport and transferred responsibility to Peninsula Diking District No. 1. Calling it a system made it sound more uniform than it was. Along the north stood a flood wall facing the Columbia River. Along the south ran a levee beside the Columbia Slough. Those were structures built specifically to restrain water. The other 2 sides had been borrowed from transportation. Denver Avenue, carried on raised earth as it approached the interstate bridge, served as the eastern wall. The old railroad fill beside Smith Lakes served as the western one. Together, these structures formed a perimeter approximately 4.9 miles long around 650 acres, a little more than 1 square mile. The levees and embankments rose between 12 and 30 feet, depending on the section and the ground beneath them. Inside was the lowland. Outside were the river, the slough, and the lakes that had once exchanged water more freely across it. That arrangement is worth seeing clearly. Vanport would not be built on a bank above the Columbia, where floodwater would need to climb toward the houses. It would be built below the surrounding barriers, inside a four-sided enclosure assembled from a flood wall, a levee, a roadbed, and a railroad grade. If you had stood near the center of that enclosure in 1941, the horizon would have been difficult to find. Raised earth interrupted the view in every direction. Beyond the northern wall, the Columbia could rise without being visible from the lowest ground. Smith Lake could press against the railroad fill from the west. The slough ran behind its southern levee. Denver Avenue crossed the eastern side above the fields. The land inside could look dry. That was the achievement. Grass could grow there. Vehicles could cross it. Surveyors could measure straight lines through a place once divided by irregular water. But dryness inside the enclosure depended on every section of its perimeter performing a task that some sections had never been built to perform. Then, in 1942, federal planners searching for somewhere to house thousands of shipyard workers examined those 6 Portland city limits. The tract was outside Portland city limits. It stood almost equally distant from Kaiser's shipyards at Vancouver, Swan Island, and St. John's. Much of its boundary was already in place. It was large, flat, and available. On paper, the water had been moved to the edges. The first construction crews arrived with graders, timber, concrete blocks, and blueprints. Behind them stood Denver Avenue. Ahead of them lay the slough. To the west, trains continued across the bank of earth separating the site from Smith Lake. No one had built that bank to protect a city. There was no city yet. On September 30th, 1942, a special train from New York City pulled into Portland carrying approximately 490 men. The newspapers called it the Kaiser Caravan. 39 of its passengers were black. They had crossed the continent because recruiters promised work in the shipyards along the Columbia and Willamette rivers. Some had been classified as welders, machinists, or other skilled workers before leaving New York. Others had no industrial experience at all. Kaiser needed both. The yards could train a man to hold a welding torch more quickly than Portland could build him a bedroom. The train was one piece of a recruitment system reaching into eastern cities, the Midwest, the South, United States territories, Canada, and Mexico. Workers came from Arkansas and Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas. They arrived alone or with families, carrying suitcases, blankets, cookware, and the addresses of employment offices. Some came for wages higher than anything available at home. Others had sons, husbands, or brothers in uniform and wanted a place inside the war effort. The work waiting for them was measured in steel. Henry J. Kaiser had entered shipbuilding in 1940 when Britain contracted with his company for cargo vessels to replace merchant ships being lost at sea. His first northwestern yard, the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation, opened the following year near St. John's, where the Willamette approaches the Columbia. Known to workers as Oregon Ship, the original 87-acre property expanded across more than 300 acres of waterfront. A second Kaiser yard opened at Vancouver, Washington, upstream from the interstate bridge. Nearly 200 acres filled with fabrication sheds, cranes, rail spurs, and building ways. Its initial payroll reached approximately 38,000 workers. The third yard occupied almost 400 acres on Swan Island. The land had served as Portland's municipal airport. By July 1942, the runways and hangars had given way to stacks of steel plate, prefabricated ship sections, welding lines, and tanker hulls. Edgar Kaiser, Henry's 34-year-old son, managed all 3 operations. The vessels were designed for repetition. A Liberty ship contained roughly 250,000 parts. Many assembled into sections weighing as much as 250 tons before reaching the building way. Cranes lifted the sections into place. Welders joined them. A finished hull stretched approximately 441 feet, long enough to carry nearly 3,000 jeeps or hundreds of tanks across an ocean. The first Liberty ship built at Oregon Ship took 131 days. By 1943, Kaiser workers were completing one in an average of 42 days. The three northwestern yards ultimately produced 752 livery Victory ships, tankers, troop transports, landing ships, and escort carriers. Every reduction in construction time increased the demand for hands. Between 1940 and the wartime peak, defense employment in the Portland and Vancouver area grew from a few thousand positions to approximately 140,000. That workforce was equal to more than 2 people for every 5 who had lived in pre-war Portland. Other shipbuilding and repair companies employed around 23,000. Roughly 92,000 workers drew paychecks from the 3 Kaiser yards alone, more people than lived in any Oregon city except Portland. They worked beneath cranes and electric lamps, through rain, river fog, and sparks falling from welded seams. Day crews left as swing crews entered. Night crews stepped onto buses while much of Portland was preparing breakfast. Shipbuilding did not stop when the city's bedrooms were full. The yards drew people who had seldom been admitted to heavy industrial work before the war. Women trained as welders, electricians, burners, crane operators, tool checkers, and ship fitters. By the end of 1942, they made up about 30% of the Kaiser shipyard workforce. In 1944, more than 31,000 women were employed across the 3 yards. Native Americans left reservations for defense jobs. Thousands of black workers came north and west, many from states where industrial unions and skilled trades had largely excluded them. Portland's black population, fewer than 2,000 before the war, would reach an estimated 15,000 by 1946. The payroll expanded faster than the housing supply. New arrivals rented spare bedrooms, enclosed porches, and spaces already divided by curtains. Workers slept in automobiles, vacant storefronts, and rooms occupied in shifts by people working different hours. Others used park benches or pitched tents near parks and riverbanks. A person could arrive with a Kaiser job badge waiting at the employment office and still have nowhere to place a suitcase that evening. Portland had entered the war as the only major West Coast city without a public housing authority. The city council created one in December 1941, but its board was tied closely to private real estate interests that did not want publicly financed homes competing with the existing market after the war. Proposed projects met neighborhood resistance. Officials also feared that building permanent housing would encourage black shipyard workers to remain in Portland. The estimated need reached approximately 37,000 additional units. The Housing Authority built about 4,900. For Edgar Kaiser, the shortage was no longer a municipal question. It was a production problem. A worker sleeping in a car might miss a shift. A welder unable to house his family might leave. An empty station along an assembly line could delay a section, a hull, and eventually a ship scheduled to carry cargo across the Pacific. Kaiser approached the United States Maritime Commission, the federal agency purchasing the vessels. If the commission wanted ships, he argued in practice, it also needed beds for the people building them. The enclosed floodplain north of Portland offered 650 acres almost equally distant from the 3 yards. Swan Island lay to the south. Oregon Ship stood to the west. The Vancouver yard could be reached across the interstate bridge. The land was outside Portland's city limits, beyond much of the city government's authority, and already surrounded by a flood wall, a levee, a road embankment, and the railroad fill beside Smith Lake. On August 18, 1942, the Maritime Commission approved construction of a housing project there. 2 days later, contractors broke ground. By the time the Kaiser caravan arrived from New York at the end of September, graders were already crossing the lowland. Behind them came trucks carrying timber, pipe, concrete blocks, and electrical cable. The shipyards had created a labor force too large for Portland to shelter. Now that labor force would be given a city. On August 20, 1942, 2 days after federal approval, contractors broke ground on the 650 acres enclosed between the Columbia River and Columbia Slough. The land was still identified on early drawings as the Denver Avenue Project. It had no established streets, zoos for thousands of residents, and no permanent houses. Within weeks, as many as 5,000 men and women were working on the site. Survey crews laid out roads while graders pushed wet earth into level strips. Trucks delivered timber, pipe, concrete blocks, electrical cable, and sheets of wallboard. Carpenters upholstered frames while utility crews worked beneath them. Instead of finishing one neighborhood before beginning the next, the project advanced across the floodplain on several fronts at once. The first plan called for 6,022 apartments. 3 days after the project began, the United States Maritime Commission increased that number to 9,922. 20 more units were eventually added. Vanport nearly doubled on paper before its first wall had been completed. The expansion changed more than the number of buildings. Additional water lines, sewer connections, electrical service, streets, classrooms, and heating equipment had to be fitted into a plan already moving toward construction. But the basic residential unit remained standardized. Repetition made speed possible. Nearly all the apartments were arranged in buildings containing 14 units. Each building had a 2-story central section, with 1-story wings extending from it. The structural frames were wood. They rested on wooden foundations rather than deep masonry basements or permanent concrete slabs. Exterior walls were painted gray, giving hundreds of repeated buildings the same surface and outline. The ground beneath them had once accepted floodwater. Now it had to support a city. Inside, a standard apartment contained a living room, a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and 1 bedroom. The kitchens were fitted for hot plates rather than full stoves. Individual bathrooms had showers but no bathtub. The walls were made from inexpensive materials and offered little separation from the adjoining unit. Residents later recalled hearing conversations, footsteps, radios, and even a sneeze carried through more than one apartment. Heating and hot water were organized collectively. Every group of 4 residential buildings shared a separate utility structure containing a coal furnace, a water heater, a laundry room, and a bathtub. A tenant who wanted to soak rather than stand beneath a shower had to leave the apartment and use the common building. The arrangement reduced the amount of equipment installed inside each unit. It also placed daily life into a repeated pattern: 4 apartment blocks, 1 utility building, then another 4 apartment blocks, and another coal furnace. Coal arrived in bulk. Laundry moved between buildings. Hot water depended on equipment shared by dozens of families working different shifts. Nothing about the housing was intended to age gracefully. The project existed under wartime rules, financed to meet an emergency and expected to be removed when the shipyards no longer required it. The materials needed to be available. The buildings needed to be warm enough for an Oregon winter. Above all, the apartments needed doors that could be opened by workers who were still sleeping in automobiles and tents. The roads were built for heavier use. Denver Avenue remained the principal approach from the east, carrying traffic toward the interstate bridge. Inside the enclosure, new pavement formed a network around Force Lake and the sloughs that crossed the site. Victory Boulevard became one of the main routes. Cottonwood Street, Force Avenue, Lake Street, Meadow Street, and Broadacre Street divided the residential blocks and connected them with the future schools, shops, and service buildings. Their names made the site sound settled before it was finished. Along Victory Boulevard, Carpenters raised apartment walls while trucks moved between piles of lumber. Near Force Avenue, underground pipes disappeared beneath newly graded surfaces. The streets had to carry construction equipment first, buses and family automobiles later. Their pavement was laid over ground from which water had been pushed but never forgotten. In November 1942, the project acquired an official name. Kaiserville had been used informally because most residents would work for Henry Kaiser, but the new city could not formally carry the name of a living person. Vanport joined the names of Vancouver and Portland, the two cities on either side of the Columbia and the two ends of the labor market the project had been built to serve. On December 12, the first tenants moved in. Only about 110 days had passed since construction began. That figure described the speed with which usable housing had appeared, not the completion of every apartment and public building. Construction continued around the first families. More residential blocks, schools, utility buildings, nurseries, and community facilities would rise during the following months. The full project took roughly a year to complete. The early tenants entered a place that was simultaneously a home and a work site. Mud bordered the new pavement. Gray apartment blocks stood beside stacks of unused timber. Trucks passed windows while crews finished nearby buildings. Beyond the northern flood wall, the Columbia moved toward the Pacific. To the west, the railroad continued carrying freight across the earthfill beside Smith Lake. The apartments solved the problem they had been built to solve. A shipyard worker could finish a night shift, board a bus, cross Denver Avenue, and unlock a private door rather than sleep inside a parked automobile. A family arriving from across the country could place its cookware in a kitchenette and its children in a bedroom before the entire city around them was finished. The buildings had been assembled quickly because they were expected to be temporary. The streets were different. They had been graded, drained, and paved to carry buses, coal trucks, fire engines, and thousands of workers moving between three shipyards. Long after the gray wooden apartments were gone, portions of those roads would still be carrying traffic. Before dawn, Vanport was already changing shifts. Some residents were pulling on work clothes and preparing to board buses for the shipyards. Others were returning through the darkness, carrying lunch pails and the fatigue of a night spent beneath cranes and welding arcs. Inside the nursery buildings, children between 2 and 12 years old could be fed breakfast before one parent left for work, or dinner before another came home. The nurseries never closed. Their hours followed the shipyards, and the shipyards followed the war. Vanport did not wake each morning. It rotated. By December 1944, residents occupied 9,568 apartments. About 42,000 people lived inside the embankments, more than in any Oregon community except Portland. Nearly 2 years earlier, the ground had been pasture, mud, and standing water. Now it held a population large enough to fill every seat in the 750-seat movie theater 56 times over. The theater stood near Cottonwood and Lake Streets. It opened 7 days a week, from early afternoon until midnight, showing 3 double features each week. Its projection equipment was modern, its sound system new, and its rows of seats offered shipyard workers several hours in which the hammering and welding belonged to somebody else's story. Outside, the street names that had appeared on construction plans now carried groceries, school books, work boots, and baby carriages. At one shopping center, residents could buy food, have shoes repaired, send a money order, leave clothes for cleaning and pressing, or arrange for newspaper delivery. A posted notice might announce a baseball game that evening. There was a post office, a bus station, a cafeteria, recreation buildings, and a public library. Force Lake had a swimming beach made with imported sand, a small piece of manufactured summer laid beside a wartime housing project built on a floodplain. Vanport's hospital contained 150 beds. Its fire protection had its own district. Law enforcement came from the Multnomah County Sheriff. A school district operated within the project, and roughly 4,000 elementary pupils attended classes in 5 buildings. There was not enough room for all of them at once, so the schools divided the day into 2 4-hour shifts. One group arrived, filled the desks, and left. Then another group entered behind them. Older students traveled into Portland for high school. The schedule belonged to a place where almost every clock answered to an industrial whistle. At the nursery centers, children could remain through a parent's entire shift. Staff members served breakfast and dinner, supervised play, and kept beds available through the night. The kitchens also prepared meals that working women could collect on the way home. A mother leaving the shipyard did not necessarily have to begin cooking the moment she reached Vanport. She could carry a hot dinner back to an apartment where the walls were thin, the cooking equipment limited, and another workday was already approaching. Those walls made privacy difficult. Residents later remembered hearing arguments, radios, footsteps, and even a neighbor sneezing more than one apartment away. A family's life passed through plasterboard and timber. Babies cried through the night shift. Alarm clocks sounded before the day shift. Doors opened and closed as one stream of workers left and another returned. The apartments had been designed for speed, but the life inside them was not temporary to the people living it. Children learned street names. Families planted small gardens where the ground allowed it. Residents organized clubs, church groups, sports teams, and neighborhood gatherings. The population had arrived from across the United States, from Canada, and from Mexico, carrying different accents, foods, habits, and expectations into buildings that looked almost identical from the road. Yet Vanport was not an incorporated city. There was no elected mayor, no city council chosen by the residents, and no municipal charter defining what authority belonged to the people who lived there. The Housing Authority of Portland owned and managed the project. It set policies, collected rents, maintained buildings, and made decisions that a city government ordinarily would have debated in public chambers. Other powers were divided among agencies. The school district handled classrooms and nurseries. The fire district handled alarms and engines. The county sheriff handled policing. A former city manager from Oregon City was brought in to administer fire protection and recreation. Vanport possessed many of the working parts of a city, but those parts did not answer to a government elected by Vanport itself. Social workers helped residents establish tenant councils, though the Housing Authority kept those councils in an advisory role. They could discuss conditions and recommend changes. The final decisions remained elsewhere. When residents proposed a community newspaper, the Housing Authority treated the idea cautiously, concerned that such a paper might give too much attention to the project's problems. The contrast could be heard in the buildings. Vanport residents could hear one another through walls, thin enough to carry a sneeze, yet their collective voice reached management only as advice. Still, the daily machinery continued. School children traded places at midday. Buses moved between the apartments and the shipyards. The hospital received patients. The library lent books. The theater's last feature ended near midnight, and several hundred people stepped back onto Cottonwood Street while another shift was beginning somewhere beyond the embankments. By population, Vanport stood second in Oregon. By law, it remained a housing project. The theater went dark each night. The nursery lights stayed on. There was no mayor's office to close. The boundary between one Vanport neighborhood and another was not a fence. It could appear as an apartment number written on a housing authority form, directing one family toward a particular row of gray buildings, while another family, arriving at the same office with the same shipyard badge, was sent elsewhere. The Housing Authority of Portland maintained that Vanport's racial patterns reflected the choices residents made among available apartments. In practice, its employees steered black tenants into designated sections. The buildings were nearly identical. They stood on the same wooden foundations, shared the same coal-fired utility houses, and faced the same mud. But the names on the leases accumulated into lines. This was how segregation could be constructed without laying another brick. Before the war, Portland had about 2,000 black residents. By 1944, the number had risen to approximately 22,000, enough people to fill Vanport's movie theater almost 30 times. Many had come from Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, and other parts of the South after Kaiser recruiters promised shipyard wages and steady work. They stepped from trains and buses into an Oregon that needed their labor more urgently than it had reconsidered its housing customs. At Vanport's peak, roughly 1 resident in 4 was black. Native Americans also came to work in the yards, joining white migrants, Mexican laborers, Canadians, and families from farming towns, mining districts, and industrial cities across the continent. They rode the same routes toward the shipyards, where steel plates arrived flat and ships departed carrying guns, aircraft, fuel, and men. Then the buses returned them to apartments arranged by race. The division was not complete, and that made Vanport more complicated than either its admirers or its critics sometimes allowed. A black child could leave an apartment in a segregated section and enter an integrated classroom. White and black pupils sat in the same school buildings, used the same desks, and moved through the same shortened 4-hour shifts. By 1945, the Vanport school system employed 7 black educators at a time when Portland Public Schools had employed none before the war. The nursery centers also brought children together while their parents worked. Inside rooms organized around meals, naps, and shipyard schedules, the categories maintained by the housing office became harder to preserve. Children arrived before breakfast or remained through dinner. Their parents might work different trades, earn different wages, and return to different sections of Vanport, but for several hours their coats hung in the same building. Outside the schools, the lines shifted again. Some recreation buildings and community activities operated on an integrated basis. On playing fields, in clubs, and at public events, residents occupied spaces that much of Portland still organized by race. Yet county law officers sometimes attempted to impose informal separation, arguing that mixed recreation might produce trouble. The threat they described was not necessarily an act that had occurred. It was the possibility of black and white residents using the same room without observing customs brought from outside Vanport. The hospital presented a more fixed boundary. Its 150 beds served the entire settlement, but its medical arrangements were segregated. A black worker injured among the scaffolds and a white worker injured beside him could be carried through the same hospital entrance and separated inside. A city assembled to build ships without interruption still preserved racial distinctions at the bedside. The same pattern appeared at service counters and shopping centers. Vanport residents bought groceries, collected mail, boarded buses, repaired shoes, and waited for laundry in buildings intended for the whole project. Yet the address to which they carried those groceries and clean shirts had already been shaped by the housing authority's assignment practices. Black residents and civil rights organizations challenged those practices. Under pressure, the authority began placing some newly arriving black families in areas previously occupied almost entirely by white tenants. White residents sometimes responded with petitions demanding that the assignments be reversed. Even in February 1945, with the war in Europe approaching its final months, housing officials met with city and state representatives to discuss the possible creation of housing reserved specifically for black occupancy. The ships were being integrated by necessity. The neighborhoods remained divided by administration. When the war ended, Vanport's population began to change. White workers who could rent or purchase homes elsewhere moved away as shipyard employment contracted. Black families encountered restrictive covenants, redlining, and real estate practices that confined them to a small portion of Portland, where available housing was already scarce. For many, remaining in Vanport was not an expression of attachment to thin walls and muddy streets. It was the address left open. Other displaced families arrived. In 1942, Japanese Americans from Oregon had been forced from their homes and confined first in assembly centers, then in incarceration camps farther inland. When the war ended, some returned to discover that their farms, businesses, leases, or household property were gone. Portland offered few easy places to begin again. Vanport, built as temporary housing for one uprooted population, became shelter for another. By 1948, approximately 300 Japanese Americans lived there. They moved into the same small apartments, used the same laundry buildings, and walked the same streets that had been named Victory, Cottonwood, Force, and Lake. Some had spent years behind fences under armed guard. In Vanport, they lived beside returning veterans, black shipyard families, Native American workers, and white households waiting for housing somewhere else. None of this made Vanport a racial utopia. Its schools could employ black teachers while its hospitals separated black patients. Its nursery rooms could be integrated while its apartment assignments placed families into racial districts. Recreation could be shared one evening and challenged by a sheriff's deputy the next. Nor was Vanport merely the collection of slums that some Portland officials later described. It contained classrooms, books, hospital beds, organized childcare, paved streets, crowded buses, and families building ordinary routines inside extraordinary arrangements. On Vanport's printed map, the streets passed continuously between the buildings. Cottonwood did not stop at a black section. Lake Street did not change its name beside a white one. Children crossed those lines on their way to integrated classrooms, then crossed them again when they went home. The map showed one city. The apartment records showed another. The war ended before Vanport did. In 1945, Kaiser's shipyards began laying off workers by the thousands. The whistles still sounded, but fewer buses answered them. Apartment windows went dark as families packed clothing, dishes, and children into automobiles or boarded trains for places they had left 3 years earlier. The roads remained. The population moved across them in the opposite direction. At its height, Vanport had held about 42,000 people. By the spring of 1948, only 18,500 remained. More than half a city had departed, leaving empty rooms behind walls, through which neighbors had once heard every alarm clock and crying baby. This decline was expected. Vanport had been financed, designed, and constructed as emergency war housing. Its wooden buildings, hot plates, shared furnaces, and narrow walls were not intended to become the foundation of a permanent Oregon community. When the emergency ended, the Housing Authority of Portland was supposed to remove almost all of the temporary housing it had administered. Empty apartments could be closed. Entire buildings could be taken out of service. As vacancy spread, the authority began dismantling parts of its wartime housing system. On paper, Vanport could be reduced row by row until the floodplain was clear again. Portland officials saw another use for the land. The 650 acres lay between railroads, highways, the Columbia River, and the industrial districts of North Portland. Warehouses, factories, freight yards, and loading platforms could occupy ground that was still covered with apartments. The Housing Authority described the site's potential for comprehensive industrial development. Temporary homes would come apart. Permanent industry would replace them. The difficulty was inside the buildings. Families with money, secure employment, or access to Portland's private housing market could leave. Many white shipyard workers purchased homes or found rentals elsewhere as wartime restrictions eased and construction resumed. Their departure created vacancies, but it did not solve the housing needs of those who remained. Black families still faced restrictive covenants, redlining, and real estate agents who would not show them homes outside a narrow portion of Portland. Even when a family had saved shipyard wages, money did not necessarily open a front door. By the end of the war, approximately 6,000 black residents remained in Vanport. For many of them, an apartment built to last only through the emergency was more obtainable than a brick house meant to last for generations. Japanese American families returning from federal incarceration encountered a different version of the same shortage. Some came back to Oregon and found their farms leased to others, their property dispersed, or their former communities hostile to their return. Vanport's apartments were small and deteriorating, but the housing authority would rent them. By 1948, roughly 300 Japanese Americans lived there. Then came the veterans. Men and women returned from military service to a Portland already short of homes. Some brought spouses. Some brought infants born during the first months of peace. Federal education benefits gave them money for tuition, but a college acceptance letter did not provide a kitchen, a bed, or a place to keep a child's clothes. The Housing Authority reserved part of Vanport for veterans, including a veterans village that eventually housed more than 1,000 people, many of them young families. At first, officials intended the veterans section for white residents. In another part of Vanport, a plan to house disabled white veterans threatened to displace black tenants already occupying the apartments. The Urban League and other civil rights groups intervened, forcing the Housing Authority to reconsider whom the new arrangements would serve. The buildings intended to disappear had become contested because too many people needed them. One of the veterans looking for a place to live was Stephen Epler, a former naval officer who arrived in Portland in early 1946 to counsel returning servicemen about education. He found what thousands of others had found. Portland offered jobs and schools, but almost no available housing. Epler moved into Vanport, where rents were low and empty buildings were beginning to appear. From inside the temporary city, he saw two shortages at once. Veterans needed apartments. They also needed classrooms. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act had opened college doors to returning military personnel, but Oregon's existing campuses did not have enough seats, instructors, jobs, or housing for everyone applying. Epler proposed an emergency two-year college at Vanport that would prepare students to continue at the state's established universities. The State Board of Higher Education approved the plan in March 1946. Epler had 86 days to find buildings, instructors, desks, and courses. Vanport already contained space that wartime commerce no longer needed. A shopping center and recreation building were converted into classrooms. On June 18, the Vanport Extension Center opened with 220 students. 94% were veterans, men and women who had exchanged military uniforms for notebooks and course catalogs. 24 instructors taught 13 classes across 8 fields. Students studied business administration, law, medicine, and the liberal arts in buildings erected for shipyard families. The first enrollment was small enough to fit inside Vanport's movie theater more than 3 times. The demand behind it was not. Epler expected perhaps 500 students for the fall term. 1,410 applied. A cafeteria became a student gathering place. Apartments housed veterans and their families within walking distance of classes. A former wartime shopping center now contained lectures, examinations, and plans for careers that might continue for decades. Vanport had been assembled because the country needed ships immediately. The college existed because the same country had brought home millions of people who needed somewhere to begin again. Yet neither the Housing Authority nor many Portland officials regarded Vanport itself as a beginning. The apartment rows were still temporary inventory. The land was still expected to become an industrial district. Buildings were removed when they became empty, while occupied buildings required repairs that prolonged the life of something intended for demolition. By 1948, Vanport was no longer the crowded shipyard city of 42,000. It was a thinner place, with vacant ground between occupied sections and fewer footsteps behind its narrow walls. But 18,100 people still slept there. Children still entered the schools. Patients still filled hospital beds. Students still opened books in converted storefronts. The city had been built to end when the war did. The war ended. On the classroom blackboards, the next term was already being planned. The winter of 1947 and 1948 did not release the Columbia Basin on schedule. Cold weather held into May, keeping mountain snow in place weeks after the spring thaw normally began. Then the temperature rose quickly and stayed high. Snow that had accumulated across hundreds of miles of mountains and tributary valleys began moving downhill as water. The first heavy rain arrived between May 19 and May 23. A second storm followed from May 26 through May 29. Rain entered streams already carrying the delayed snowmelt, and those streams fed the Columbia. By the final week of May, the river had reached levels not seen since the Great Flood of 1894. Vanport experienced the rise from below. On Tuesday, May 25, the Columbia and Willamette rivers stood at 23 feet, 8 feet above flood stage. The water outside Vanport's defenses climbed higher than the floors, streets, and wooden foundations inside. Nothing had yet entered the city. The difference existed as pressure against earth, concrete, timber, and railroad fill. The four-sided system planted at the beginning of the story now carried the weight of the river. The flood wall faced the Columbia on the north. The southern dike bordered Columbia Slough. Denver Avenue formed the eastern barrier. Along the west, the railroad embankment separated Vanport from Smith Lake. Only the northern and southern defenses had been built as flood control works. Denver Avenue had been constructed as a road. The western embankment had been piled high enough to carry trains across low ground. Both had become walls because Vanport needed 4 of them. Officials began continuous patrols of the northern and southern dikes. When Smith Lake rose against the railroad fill, patrols were extended there as well. Firefighters and other workers walked the embankments in 4-hour shifts, looking for seepage, soft earth, muddy water, or movement in the slopes. Beyond the tracks, familiar pieces of land disappeared. Roads near Smith Lake went under. Water reached buildings around the lake and crept toward a riding academy. The Columbia, Smith Lake, and the neighboring sloughs began to resemble parts of one continuous surface, interrupted by fills and dikes. Inside Vanport, life continued through the last Saturday in May. The college prepared for another term. Stores opened. Children played among apartment rows built on ground now lower than the water outside them. On May 29, representatives of the Housing Authority, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Red Cross, the Sheriff's Office, and other agencies met at Red Cross headquarters. Evacuation was discussed. Vanport contained approximately 18,000 residents. The Housing Authority and Red Cross estimated that emergency shelter could be found for 9,000 to 10,000 people. Even at the upper estimate, thousands would have nowhere prepared to go. Many Vanport households did not own automobiles and depended entirely upon buses to reach Portland, the shipyards, or any ground beyond the dikes. Officials did not order an evacuation. They scheduled another meeting for Monday, May 31. Before that meeting could occur, there would be Memorial Day. At approximately 4 o'clock on Sunday morning, Housing Authority workers distributed a bulletin beneath the doors of Vanport's apartments. The paper stated that the flood situation had not changed. Unless something unforeseen occurred, it said, Vanport was safe. If evacuation became necessary, a continuous siren and air horn would sound. Trucks equipped with loudspeakers would move through the streets with instructions. The bulletin ended with 4 short sentences. Remember, dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited. Residents found the notice when they woke. Some had already seen the water standing against the embankments. Some telephoned the fire station for information. Others prepared for church, work, or a Sunday away from the apartment rows. It was a holiday morning beneath clear weather. The patrols continued. Fire Captain Robert English reported for duty at 7:30. For 2 days his department had been walking the defenses around the clock. The men had been instructed to watch for blisters in the embankment, heavy seepage, muddy discharge, and boils. A boil was water forcing its way upward through soil under pressure, sometimes carrying the earth with it. One boil appeared at the base of the southern dike. A separate leak emerged beneath the northern flood wall. Workers placed sandbags over both and reported them. At 9:15, a man telephoned the fire station about muddy water near the northwest corner of Vanport. It was coming beneath the railroad fill, close to Meadows and Broadacre Streets, on the Vanport College grounds. English went to the location, where railroad personnel and an engineer were already examining it. Sandbags and workers were ordered to the embankment. At 9:45, another boil was found near Denver Avenue and Cottonwood Street at the southwestern corner of Vanport. The names planted on construction drawings 6 years earlier had become coordinates in a patrol report. Cottonwood marked one weak point. Meadows and Broadacre marked another. By 10:15, the leak under the railroad fill was worsening. English sent a crew of 10 to 12 men. They carried sandbags to the Vanport side of the embankment and worked above ground, saturated by water moving through the fill. The city remained occupied. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, additional men were sent to the railroad embankment because the leak was still running badly. Worried residents continued calling the fire station. English later said that officials kept assuring him there was no immediate danger, and he passed that information to the people on the telephone. No evacuation siren sounded. No continuous air horn began. Buses were not assembled to carry 18,000 people out of the basin. The follow-up meeting remained scheduled for the next morning. At 3:00, the fire crews were ordered back to their station. On apartment floors across Vanport, the bulletin still carried the same first sentence. The dikes were safe at present. At approximately 4:17 on the afternoon of May 30, the Western Railroad fill opened. The first hole was only about 6 feet across. On one side stood Smith Lake, swollen with water from the Columbia. On the other lay the low ground of Vanport College, its converted shopping center, classrooms, streets, and wooden apartment buildings. Water entered the fill, carrying soil with it. The opening widened. What had begun as a small hole eventually became a gap roughly 500 feet across. Smith Lake poured east. A shout reached the Vanport fire station that the railroad barrier had broken. Sirens began sounding from fire and sheriff's vehicles. Fire Captain Robert English attempted to activate the stationary air horn promised in the morning bulletin, but floodwater shorted the equipment before it could work. The continuous warning Vanport residents had been told to expect never fully came. Near Cottonwood Street, Franklin Blair had been playing catch with his younger brother when he heard a boom. He looked west and saw water coming down the street. He grabbed the boy, ran toward the elevated Denver Avenue embankment, and climbed the ramp to higher ground. Others first saw people running. They stepped outside, followed the movement of the crowd, and then saw the water behind it. Families left cooking on stoves and meals set on tables. Some had placed clothing, papers, and radios on beds, believing the water might enter only the lower rooms. The first moving buildings showed how far above the floors it would rise. The flood did not reach every apartment at once. Vanport's sloughs, drainage channels, and low depressions received the first volume of water, slowing its movement through the central sections. The same uneven ground that had made the city difficult to build gave many residents several additional minutes to escape. About 35 minutes separated the breach from the broad inundation of the city. 35 minutes was enough to run. It was not enough to move a household. Ida Mae Shepard's mother had cooked a turkey that Sunday. When the family left, she wrapped it in a dish towel, placed it in a shopping bag, and carried it with her. They did not own a car, so they boarded a Rose City Transit bus sent into Vanport. Looking back, Shepard saw water moving along the street above the level where her family had placed its belongings for safety. Other buses entered as the evacuation began, but thousands of residents were already trying to reach the few routes over the surrounding embankments. Automobiles crowded Denver Avenue, the raised roadway forming Vanport's eastern wall. Traffic stopped. Drivers left their cars where they stood and continued on foot, carrying children, handbags, blankets, or nothing. Behind them, water reached the apartment foundations. The wooden bases that had allowed Vanport to rise quickly from swampy ground now released the buildings from it. 14-unit structures lifted, turned, and moved across streets that had been paved only 6 years earlier. Some remained together for a time. Others separated under the force of the current, their walls folding and their roofs settling onto the water. Cars rolled and floated between them. Staircases led into brown water. The nursery buildings, hospital, library, theater, and college entered the same moving field of timber, furniture, automobiles, and mud. The first surge was reported at roughly 10 feet high. In some places, it struck the nearest row of buildings within a minute of the siren. Farther east, residents watched it cross the open spaces and sloughs, losing speed in one depression before rising into the next. At 4:50, electricity failed. The streets no longer had power, but the evacuation continued along Denver Avenue. Police, firefighters, neighbors, and passing motorists pulled people toward the embankment. When buses could no longer reach everyone, the sheriff's office called for boats. They arrived from across the Portland area. Rescuers took people from second-floor windows. Children were passed downward into boats. As the water climbed, residents moved from upper rooms onto roofs, and the boats collected them there. Floating apartment buildings became both hazards and temporary platforms, carrying people while walls and utility sheds moved around them. A radio station in Vanport's northeastern section remained on the air until 5:21. About half an hour after its signal ended, a drifting apartment building struck one of its towers and brought it down. By 9 that evening, search crews believed that no one remained stranded. Vanport's surviving residents were gathering on higher ground, at Red Cross stations, in churches, schools, private homes, and public buildings across Portland. Most had escaped with whatever could be held in two hands. The number of deaths remained uncertain for months. During the first days, officials and eyewitnesses offered estimates ranging from a few victims to several hundred. The absence of recovered bodies initially increased the confusion. Stories spread that authorities had hidden hundreds of victims in cold storage buildings or secretly removed them to protect Portland's approaching Rose Festival. No evidence established those claims. A high school student and an adult later admitted fabricating some of the stories. The Multnomah County coroner eventually placed 15 names on the official list of people killed, while acknowledging that other victims might never have been recovered. The official figure is 15. Claims of hundreds remain unproven. The water did not leave with the residents. On June 1, the Columbia crested at 30 feet and 2/10 of a foot, then began a slow retreat. Vanport remained submerged for weeks, its buildings stranded, broken, or carried away from their foundations. 18,500 people had awakened that morning with an address. By nightfall, the addresses existed only on maps. Vanport was not rebuilt. When the water finally withdrew, it left apartment buildings twisted across streets, roofs resting in mud, concrete foundations exposed and automobiles lodged where the current had dropped them. The Housing Authority had once debated how quickly to dismantle the city. The Columbia had completed the work without preserving the materials. The residents did not move together. During the first nights, the Red Cross recorded names at schools, churches, the Portland Armory, the Young Men's Christian Association, the Jewish Community Center, and American Legion halls. Some families entered private homes opened by Portland residents. Others slept on cots beneath gymnasium lights, waiting to learn whether relatives had escaped and whether anything remained inside Vanport. Temporary shelter could be found. Permanent housing was harder. White families with money or local connections generally had access to a wider rental market. Black families encountered the same restrictive covenants, real estate practices, and neighborhood boundaries that had kept many of them in Vanport after the war. More than 1,000 displaced black families now needed housing in a city that had already confined most black residents to North and Northeast Portland. Many entered Albina, where older houses and apartments were divided to absorb the additional population. Rooms filled. Rents rose. Families doubled up with relatives or rented spaces that had not been intended as separate homes. The flood had removed Vanport's segregated apartment sections, but it had not removed the lines governing the rest of Portland. The former residents scattered through addresses across the city and beyond it. Their schools, clubs, tenant councils, nurseries, and shopping centers did not move with them. A community of 18,500 people became thousands of separate housing cases. One Vanport institution did move. The Vanport Extension Center lost its classrooms, records, desks, and buildings in the flood. Its summer session was scheduled to begin in June. Closing the school would have been simple. It was only 2 years old, occupied borrowed buildings, and had been created as an emergency response to veteran enrollment. Instead, classes resumed at Grant High School on June 14, 15 days after the flood. That location lasted through the summer. In the fall, the college moved again, this time into an abandoned administration building at the former Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation yard in St. John's. Students who had once studied inside a wartime housing project now attended classes beside a shipyard that no longer built ships. The school remained there until 1952. It then moved into the former Lincoln High School building along Portland's South Park blocks and became the Portland State Extension Center. It gained 4-year status as Portland State College in 1955. In 1968, it became Portland State University. The institution had moved from a converted Vanport shopping center to a high school, from the high school to an abandoned shipyard, and from the shipyard to the center of Portland. The city that contained its first classrooms had no such route. For several years, the former Vanport site remained a field of mud, water, broken foundations, and surviving pavement. Proposals came and went. Portland considered the land for industry and, for a time, as a possible site for a memorial coliseum. The federal government still controlled much of the property, and transferring it to the city required years of negotiation. In 1953, Portland Mayor Fred Peterson requested approximately 640 acres for industrial and public development. By the beginning of the 1960s, the city had acquired much of the former Vanport ground and renamed the area West Delta Park. The land was still low. Pumps, drainage channels, retention ponds, flood walls, and levees remained necessary because the geography beneath Vanport had not changed. The Columbia still passed to the north. Columbia Slough still marked the south. Smith Lake remained beside the Western Railroad line. Portland gradually divided the site among different uses. Open fields became Delta Park. On the western portion, the city built a public golf course that opened in 1971. It was later renamed Heron Lakes, after the birds nesting among the lakes, grass, and wetlands. Earth-moving equipment shifted hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of soil and excavated new water features across ground where Vanport College and apartment rows had once stood. Another section required less invention. When Portland acquired the former Vanport property in 1960, most of the buildings were gone. Concrete foundations remained in places, but the paved street system was still largely intact. The water had lifted wooden apartments and rolled automobiles. It had not carried away all the asphalt. Local racing enthusiasts saw a course already laid across the flat ground. The Portland Junior Chamber of Commerce helped organize the surviving roads into a circuit, and in 1961 the first Rose Cup race was held as part of the Portland Rose Festival. The early course followed portions of Vanport's old streets. Race cars accelerated along pavement once used by shipyard buses, grocery trucks, baby carriages, and families walking to the movie theater. Drivers who left the roadway risked striking leftover foundations or entering ponds and sloughs. The track was later rebuilt and repaved, becoming Portland International Raceway. Vanport's wooden buildings had floated from their foundations. Its hospital, library, schools, and nursery rooms had disappeared. Cottonwood, Lake, Force, and Victory no longer appeared as the streets of an inhabited city. But the pavement placed across the floodplain during those 110 days remained useful. On race days, engines carry across Smith Lake and the Columbia Slough. Cars pass over the old street grid, their tires pressing against the ground Vanport's builders paved in 1942. Then the sound moves around the next turn.